Okay, if you have got... Am I standing too close to this? There seems to be some big old ringing. Is anyone else hearing that, or is it just me? Is it just me? Okay. It's a good start, isn't it? Okay, so as someone who speaks quite regularly, if you've ever done this kind of thing, you know that when you're preparing a talk, you're quite often looking for something you can hook everything you're going to say around. Looking for something in the news which you think, that's the thing which is going to help me get it. And this week, there was one of those moments for me, and it could be that you're a fan of architecture and history. If you are, I'm really sorry for using this as an illustration, but when it happened for me, I thought, that's it. That's the thing I've got to use. And it was the fire in Notre Dame. That's a building which has stood for over 850 years. It's outlived many moments of history. It stood through the 100 Years' War between England and France, and it stood through that unscathed. It was untouched during the French Revolution. It survived long periods of neglect, and through both world wars, it only got a few bullet holes in it. And yet this week, in a matter of mere hours, the fire took hold, its roof collapsed, and that iconic spire crumbled into dust and crumbled into rubble. Now that building, if it's going to be used in the future, is going to need all that rubble clearing away. It's going to need to be rebuilt. A massive, massive restoration project is going to need to be undertaken if that building is going to return to what it once was. And in fact, if you've been following the news, President Macron has already stated that that cathedral is going to be rebuilt, and he's promised that it's going to be better than it was before. And it was those words that made me kind of get what I needed to say tonight. What the resurrection is about. It's about lives which turn into rubble being restored and being better than they were before. That building is always in its history going to be defined by this fire. But people are in the future, maybe in 200-300 years, will be able to say, but look at it now. Look at it now. And tonight, as we look into the Bible, we're going to focus on a man who, just like that cathedral on the screen, his life was defined by fire. His life was defined by the events around 2 fires, to be exact. And that man is the man we know in the Bible as Peter. And at one of these fires, the first one before Jesus is crucified, he's full of bravado, he's full of self-assurance, and it all gets stripped away from him. He sees himself as he truly is, and he's devastated by it, absolutely devastated. The other fire he encounters in daylight, and all of the mess that he'd made is brought into the light, and he's restored. And he's restored to a position that he had before, but he's also restored to something greater, and he's going to be far more useful than he ever was because of these 2 events. And tonight, I want you to think about this. Is that something which can be true for you? Is that something which can be true for you? Can God restore the rubble of your life and make it better than it ever was before? Easter would say yes, and I want to show you why. So if you ever hit a point where you think, my life has just crumbled into dust, or if you're there right now, Easter is about restoration. It's about reconciliation. It's where God takes people who are far from him and he says, these are mine, these are my children. It's when he says he is going to restore all things at one point in the future. And so I want to ask you this at this moment. What's your rubble? What's your rubble? It might be fresh and you might know exactly what it is. It might be long buried. What is it for you? For Peter, as he stands around this fire on the beach with Jesus, it's the realization that he is not the man that he thought he was. On that Friday, he denied that he ever knew Jesus 3 times. He'd let his friend down, he'd let his God down, he'd let himself down, and it blew apart who he thought he was. All of his promises, all of his strength just evaporated away. And it was in the face of a weak servant girl. The big brave fisherman couldn't stand in front of her. He saw himself properly for the first time and he crumbled. That was his rubble. What's yours? It might be similar to Peter's. It might be regret. But it could be that your rubble is chronic illness. It could be loneliness. It could be singleness. It could be that you're in a marriage that is on fire and not in a good way. It might be fear regarding your children. It might be a temptation which trips you up over and over and over again, and you think, that's my rubble, and I don't want anyone to ever know about it. It might be, as I say these things, you're thinking to yourself, my life is great. I don't have anything like that. Well, that's great for now, but the question for you has to be this. What are the parts of your life that if they suddenly fell apart, you'd feel like you'd never recover from it? What would be like the roof falling in for you? Because that's your potential rubble one day. If you lose your career, if you lose your health, if you lose your family. Tonight is about preparing for that moment when the roof does fall in. Or if the roof has fallen in, it's seeing how Jesus transforms it. And so here's the first thing to think about as we think about Peter on the beach with Jesus. And the first thing is this. Jesus restores and he rebuilds people who feel like their lives have turned to ash. He restores and he rebuilds people whose lives look like they've turned to ash. And it might well be that as you sit there, you know this. You know that Jesus is all about forgiveness. You know that Christianity is all about forgiveness. You know that we sing songs about God's mercy being vast and his grace being amazing. But I'm sometimes convinced of this. We don't know what we think we know. It sits in our head as a piece of information, but it never really hits our heart and we don't experience it properly. We know it as a statement, but we're not quite sure it applies to us. And we wonder, is Jesus going to leave me like a derelict building? Or is he going to restore me? Is he going to leave me in the rubble? Or is he going to change things? If that's you tonight, listen to how Jesus deals with Peter. Listen to it. Because what he's going to do with him is he's going to make him confront his failures. He's going to show him his disloyalty. He's going to show him exactly who he is. And then he's going to show him, yeah, and I can still use you. And you can still be brilliant for me. And possibly more than any of the other disciples, he needs to know it. Because at this point in the story, Peter knows that Jesus is alive, but he's probably unsure of what it means for him personally. He's probably feeling really conflicted about what's been going on. He's possibly overjoyed that Jesus is back, but he's wondering if he blew it and if there is any way back, especially as his friend is quite clearly everything that he claimed to be. If someone comes back to life, that's someone who's clearly God. So Peter is probably thinking, how does this work now? Just days previously, he disagreed with Jesus publicly. And he said that even if everyone else abandoned him, even if everyone else let him down, he never would. He almost said, no, not me, not me. He almost had the air about him of, come on, bring it on. I will show you that I am for you. And when Jesus tells him that that very night he's going to deny him 3 times, he doesn't even believe it's possible. But sure enough, if you know the Easter story well, that night when Jesus is arrested, Peter stands around a fire with a group of people. And to protect himself and out of fear, he says these words, I don't know the man. I've never known the man. Self-protection kicked in, and he realized who he truly was. And in Matthew's account of that event, we learn that at that moment, his eyes and Jesus' eyes lock, and he goes out and he weeps bitterly. He weeps bitterly. This is a guy who is probably full of turmoil and fear and adrenaline and aggression and misery on that night. And maybe some words that Jesus said are just going through his mind and haunting him because they'll be thinking, on one occasion, Jesus said, anyone who disowns me before men, I'll disown before my Father. Maybe he's thinking, that's it. That's it. And I think it's fair to say that what's happened to Peter is his mistake has been burnt into his memory. And he probably feels a bit like rubble. He doesn't know whether there's any coming back from this. They say that shame is really, really powerful. It's been said it's like this. Shame has the ability to affect the whole sense of self. It's powerful, painful, and can become central to one's identity and life story. Shame can colour everything. It bleeds back in time and covers good memories and makes them bad. It taints the present and it says about the future it's just going to be rubbish. That's what shame does. And it looms like a shadow at this point over Peter. He's failed. He's failed. And he's probably wondering, is it ever going to be the same again? And it might be that for some of us in the room, Peter's experience strikes a chord. That we can think back on, and there's something that taints the past. There's something that damages the present. Something that casts a shadow over the future. And we live there. And we live there. And we wonder whether A, God can still use us, or B, if he even still wants to. We sometimes wonder, I think, is God done with me? Is he done with me? At that first fire that Peter stood around, it reduced him to rubble. So how does Jesus deal with someone who's rubble? Well, he does it brilliantly. And he's generous and he's kind and he shows people that even their failures can be completely restored. So on this beach, on this second beach, with this second fire, Peter is going to experience a couple of moments which are going to collide in his mind, like flashbacks in a film. One is going to take him right back to when he first met Jesus and was full of hope, and the other is going to remind him of his deepest failures. And these two things are going to collide, and we're going to see what Jesus does with them. So how does this event on the beach play out? Jesus has been raised from the dead. Peter is a guy who I think he can't abide inactivity. He'd be one of those annoying people who's always saying we've got to do something. And it seems like he just wants to go out and go fishing. And yet, when he fishes, on this day he can't even do that right anymore. They fish all night and they catch nothing. Now, for me, fishing seems like one of the most boring activities at the best of times. But to fish all night and catch nothing, that's got to be the most boring experience ever. And so that's the night he's had. And on the morning, when the boat's coming back towards the beach, there's a figure, a helpful figure on the beach, who calls out very helpfully, "You haven't got any fish, have you?" And that's gonna please a fisherman who's caught nothing. And then he says, "Put your net in on the right side and you'll find some." And for whatever reason, experienced fishermen take advice from a stranger on a beach. And the net is immediately full to bursting. And the truth suddenly dawns on one person in the boat who says, "That guy on the beach, it's Jesus. It's Jesus." And for all of them, but probably especially Peter, this is a flashback moment. He's probably right back to where he began following Jesus. Because on that day, Peter was part of the crowds that Jesus was teaching by the shore. He asked Peter, "Can I use your boat? Just so I can teach from there." And then once he'd done his teaching, he said, "Let's go out into the water and fish." And Peter's response that day was exactly the same as this one. "We worked all night, we didn't catch anything." But he then says, "But we'll try. Just because it's you, we'll try." And boom, on that day, a massive catch of fish as well. On that first day, when he caught all the fish, Peter fell to his knees and he said to Jesus, "Get away from me, I'm a sinful man." And Jesus said to him, "Follow me and you'll catch people." That would have been a really big moment in his history. Jesus was saying to him there, "I'll use you. You're going to be significant." Dreams were probably birthed in his heart on that day about what he might do for God. He was being told, "I'm going to use you. You're really significant." And so now in this second boat, that memory is probably resurfacing because it's exactly like it. And he's thinking, back then Jesus gave me a destiny. This is just like that. And then he possibly thinks, is this for me or is this just for the other guys? Is this for me or is it for them? And Peter, being the emotional guy that he is, he jumps into the water with his coat on. Super decision, that one. So he can get to Jesus, and he walks up the beach. And for a moment, it's just the two of them on the beach, Jesus and Peter. No one else is there. I imagine that's a fairly awkward moment. When Jesus says to them, bring some fish, Peter's the first guy getting the fish and dragging the nets in. I've no idea what happened in those moments when they're alone on the beach. But I suspect as Peter dragged himself up the water and was running up the beach to see Jesus, another memory came to mind. Because as he runs up there, if you read it, he says, there's a fire there. Jesus is standing by a fire. And he'd have seen those coals burning away, and he'd have probably been reminded of that fire from a couple of days previously, where he denied ever knowing Jesus. And perhaps the memory of them locking eyes on that night comes right back to him, and he thinks, oh no, what happens now? And he might want to just bury that moment, but he can't, and Jesus won't let him. Jesus won't let him bury that moment. The two memories of his dream and his failure are coming together, and which one's going to win? And the answer is actually neither of them, but this one, this new memory. Because I'm convinced that this barbecue they have on the beach is a pivotal moment in Peter's life. Because now he knows who he is. He knows he's a failure. He knows he's got flaws. He knows his weaknesses. He knows he's broken. He knows he can't do what Jesus called him to do. And there's a fire. And maybe part of him is thinking, Jesus, please don't push this. Please don't bring up the other night. But Jesus does, because he needs to restore Peter. There was a picture following the fire in Notre Dame where there was a golden cross pictured through the rubble. Did anyone see that one? And some people posted it online saying things like this: how can you not believe in God when you see this? To which someone very helpfully put, it doesn't really prove much other than that gold burns at a higher temperature than wood. So if you think the picture proves that God's real, it probably doesn't. But there's an illustration there. There's an illustration that if you see the cross of Jesus, if you see your rubble and you see the cross of Jesus through it, then you've got hope. Because the rubble has destiny behind it. The cross is destiny. So what does Jesus do? He confronts Peter with 3 questions. Peter denied him 3 times. Jesus says 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? That's going to take him right back to his failure. And Peter says 3 times, yeah, you know I love you, Lord. Because he does. He really does. And every time Jesus asks those questions, it's like he's saying to Peter, you failed me, you know. And he says, I know, every single time. But every single time as well, Jesus then says, but I've still got a job for you. Feed my sheep. Look after my lambs. And maybe Jesus is wounding Peter in this moment, but he's also healing him as well. He's getting him to see that even his greatest failures can be swallowed up by grace, swallowed up by it. When Peter says, I'm broken and I'm rubble to Jesus, Jesus says, now I can use you. Now you've seen that, I can use you. So what do we learn from this? Well, I think we learn a number of things. One of them is, if you want to be used by God, you've got to see the rubble of your life and see the cross shining through it and covering it. Because Jesus will restore you no matter what your rubble is. Jesus is gracious with Peter. He takes his biggest regret and he covers it and he gives him something to do. It's almost as if he's saying, yeah, you did fail me, Peter. You recognize it, you love me, and I can use you now. In the book of 1 John, there's one of my favorite verses in the Bible, which says this: if we confess our sins, He's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Peter did this. When he's saying to Jesus, I failed you, he's confessing that he was hopeless and he was forgiven. And those who get forgiven loads love much, the Bible says. Peter loved Jesus because he realized just how much he'd been forgiven. If your life feels like rubble, if there's some memory that you keep going back to and you think, I did that and I blew it, admit it to him. He knows it anyway, actually. Admit it to him, and you'll hear him saying through his word, you might not hear it in your head, but you'll hear him saying, I can use you now. I can use you. If your rubble is something different, because sometimes rubble is different, he can help you in that too. Sometimes being forgiven by Jesus doesn't mean there aren't consequences to the past. You are, if you follow Jesus, a restoration project. And once you're one of them, once you know how much he's done for you, you will see people with new eyes. If you are a restoration project that was a mess, when you see someone else who is in a mess and you can see it, you won't look at them as lost causes, but as people who can be restored to something more wondrous than they could ever believe. Peter's worst moment was plunged into the grace of God, and he changed it. It no longer had the power to colour his past, affect his future, or cast a shadow over the present. He could always be useful to Jesus from this point onwards. So maybe in this room tonight, there are people who think they have something that defines them, who feel like their life is rubble. Make this your moment on the beach with Jesus. Bring it to mind. It might have languished in the back of your memory for years. Bring it right up in front of you now and say to Jesus, this is my rubble. Restore it. So if your marriage feels like rubble, tell him that. And he might give you the grace to still walk in it. If there's a relationship that you've got which you just feel you've set ablaze and it's just gone completely messy, admit it to Jesus with no qualifications and he'll help you with it. When you do these kind of things, he says to you, I can use you like never before. And I'm just going to close with this thought. When we think of that cathedral in Notre Dame at the minute, we see it as rubble. We see it as rubble. Architects, when they start working on what it's going to be, will see what it will be. They will have their plans and they will see its glory before it's finished. Jesus does that with you now. If you think your life is a mess, he sees your mess, but if you follow him, he sees also what he will turn you into. Something wonderful. A son or daughter that he loves. You're not just a project for him. He sees the work completed as well. And he always will. So, Easter is about being restored. Restored to God, but also restored to who you should be. And I just want to encourage you, if you feel like life is rubble, go to Jesus and see what he can do with it. Let's pray. Father God, we, if we're honest, come to you tonight and we say there are parts of our lives which are just rubble. There are things that we get wrong. There are sins that trip us up time and time again. There are things that we do that we don't want anyone else to know. There are parts of our character which we think, I wish I wasn't like that. When we look at how you treat Peter, we know that you already know that. You know all those things about us that we try and hide. And you're just waiting for the opportunity to say, I can restore you if you give it to me. I can change you if you give it to me. I can give you strength to endure being in the rubble if you give it to me. And so we ask this, whatever that thing is for us, that we'd be able to give it to you now. And we might be able to move into our future, where we are not just a project, but we're your finished work. And we ask this in your precious name. Amen.